The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. On April 15th, 2014, on the biblical feast of Passover, the first of 4 blood moons appeared, and soon after, the Hamas terrorists began firing a barrage of rockets to kill Israeli citizens, and the Israeli-Gaza war broke out.
I'm watching television. I'm watching the major news shows, and all of a sudden, internationally known evangelists are on these secular news shows talking about the blood moons. So I do a little research, and I find out that everyone that I'm aware of found out their basic information from Mark Biltz. Tell me a bit about your background, that you know these things.
Well, sure, I'd love to, Sid. To me, this is so exciting. I feel like just a little kid. And when I was a little kid, I loved astronomy. And I'd be laying down out on the grass, and I'd be looking up at the heavens, and like Psalms 19, where it says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And I would just be looking up, and I just love it. And I had a telescope, and I'd always be trying to find the moons around Jupiter and the ring around Saturn. And then as I got older and I became a believer and filled with the Holy Spirit, and I just loved God, and all of a sudden I found out about the feasts of the Lord. And I realized they weren't the Jewish feasts, but they were the Lord's feasts. And I'm going to NASA's website because I love math, I love science. And I had seen this beautiful total lunar eclipse over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And I got to thinking about the Bible verses, you know, with the moon turning to blood and the sun to sackcloth. And so what did I do? I said, well, let's see if there's any interesting eclipses coming up. And so I looked, and I saw there were these 4 total lunar eclipses in a row. And I thought, well, how often does that happen? And so I was going to NASA's website, and I saw it didn't happen at all in the 1800s, didn't happen in the 1700s, didn't happen in the 1600s.
So it's pretty rare.
It's very, as a matter of fact, after my research, I found it has only happened 8 times in the last 2,000 years
that
rare. These have fallen on the biblical feast days. But that's what was so amazing. I'm in my prayer closet. It's about 4 in the morning. I was getting up, early for a long time. And I'm praying, and all of a sudden, it's like this voice comes and says, Mark, put these on the biblical holidays. Because when I was on NASA's website, it had like April and October, April and September, and it was like a download. And so I get all excited, and I run out to my computer, and I get on the computer, and I see they fell on Passover and Tabernacles, Passover and Tabernacles. So now I'm ready to jump out of my skin. I can't believe this. Oh, my gosh, you know. And so I go back, and I look, and then I see when else they've happened in history, and it just blew me away.
Well, the thing that is so amazing to me, tell me about the last set of tetrads. That's 4 of these blood moons in a row. One was just happened to be in 1948. Another one just happened to be in 1967. What significant things happened in 1948 and I think all of you know. Do many of you know what happened in 48 and 67? But just in case.
Well, sure. Well, the thing that amazed me concerning the math is, you know, according to NASA, over 5,000 years, you only average 1 total lunar eclipse every year and a half. And here we have 4 within a year and a half, and they're falling on the feast days. And the last time it happened was when Israel recaptured Jerusalem in 1967 and 1968. And when I saw that, it was like, oh, good grief, this is supernatural. And so I go running back, and I look at the next date, and it was right after Israel became a nation in 1948. It happened in 1949 and 50. And so now my mind's reeling, so I have to go back, and I got to do some more research. And I'm going back, and I find out it happened during the Inquisition, 1492. When Columbus sails the ocean blue.
Now, why was that? Now, that was pretty bad for us Jewish people, because we Jews were literally left, if we didn't leave, we'd be murdered. So it wasn't too good for us Jewish people, but it had an effect on the world. What was that?
Well, sure it did, because they expelled all the Jews on the 9th of Av, and also in Portugal in 1493, 1494. What happens? King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are taking all the Jewish wealth, but that is what helped finance the finding of the New World and all the Jews coming over to America.
So, in your opinion, if the Jews hadn't been expelled, and Christopher Columbus, who is Jewish, and you told me also there were a number of his crew that were Jewish. Why? Because they had to leave Spain. They might not have founded America.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And you know what? As I went back further, at the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D.
That's going way back.
Way back. Solar lunar eclipses all over the biblical holidays. And then during the time of Messiah's death, 32, 33 A.D., solar lunar eclipses all over the biblical holidays. And so I'm thinking, God is true. Because that same word that's translated as either fall or food literally means a divine appointment. That's what the Hebrew word moed means. And how many of you believe in divine appointments? I mean, obviously.
So, and how many of you want to know the sign for a divine appointment? I sure do.
Well, the thing to me is, also I realize they're scheduled. There's some divine appointments that are scheduled, like Passover, like the Feast of Tabernacles. And each one of these feasts in Hebrew is called a mikra. Now, we translate that as convocation, but the Hebrew word implies a dress rehearsal. So every time on Passover, the Jews went through the dress rehearsal of killing the Passover lamb on Passover, because that is when the event was going to happen. So he died on Passover. He was buried on unleavened bread. He rose on the Feast of First Fruits. And the Spirit was poured out on the Feast of Pentecost, or Shavuot. But most Christians don't know the Jews have been keeping Pentecost for every year for 1,500 years.
So what you're saying is, not only are these biblical feasts shadows of every major event in the first coming of the Messiah, but you go even further. You're saying to the exact day, and in some cases, they're to the exact hour. Explain.
Exactly. It was at the third hour of the day they bound the Lord to the cross, it says. Well, that's 9 in the morning, the time of the morning sacrifice. So at the very moment, the high priest is binding the Passover lamb to the altar. They're binding the Lamb of God to the cross, and they're singing the Psalms. They would always sing Psalms 113 through Psalms 118. Did you know that God had David write the funeral song for his son 1,000 years before? The very moment they're binding the Passover lamb to the altar, they're binding Yeshua to the cross, Josephus records 2.5 million Jews are in Jerusalem, and there's this choir that is singing, and the words they're singing is, bind the sacrifice with cords, even to the horns of the altar. This is what they're singing at the very moment. This is what he's hearing while they're binding him to the cross. And then at noon, when he's lifted up, and he said, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men unto me. Guess what they're singing? Psalms 118. And what are the words? The right hand of the Lord is lifted up. The right hand of the Lord is exalted. So not only did he fulfill the feast to the day, but to the very single hour.
I have to ask you this. If the first feasts are perfect shadows to the day, the hour, the events in the death and resurrection of Jesus, what about the last few feasts? What are they shadows of?
Well, do you believe the Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever?
Of course.
I mean, do you really believe that?
I really believe that.
Well, if you really believe it, if he fulfilled the spring feast to the day of his first coming, he'll fulfill the fall feast to the day of his second coming.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Saddam, this is the most important question. We have this tetrad and the last blood moon of the 4 that are coming up. But you say there are certain things about this last tetrad that has never happened in history. Are you sure?
Yes.
If everything is being fulfilled to the day, to the hour at the first coming of the Messiah through God's biblical feasts, or as Mark explained, his appointments, then the last feast will be his return to the day and the hour. But is there anywhere in the Bible that gives us a clue that the devil's going to tamper with the calendar so that we'll miss the signs?
You bet there is. It's in the book of Daniel. And think about this. If you were in business and your competitor, you had an appointment, if he could get a hold of your day timer and change it, he would love to have you miss the appointment.
Of course.
Well, God doesn't want us to miss the appointments, and he always warns before he brings judgment. And guess what? In Daniel, it says one of the things the Antichrist tries to do is change the times and the seasons.
I remember that. Do you remember that? I do.
That's referring to the feast days. That's referring to God's appointed times when he's going to intersect human history. So significant.
So, speaking of intersecting human history, we have this tetrad, the 4 blood moons, and the last one will be the most unusual that ever has occurred in history. In fact, we don't even have any more of these tetrads scheduled that occur on feast days for over 400 years after that. Why is it so unusual, Mark?
Well, have you ever heard of a super moon?
I actually heard of it because I interviewed you on radio. Before that, I didn't know diddly.
Well, here's what a super moon is. Here's the Earth, and here's the moon. And the moon's orbit around the Earth is elliptical. It's far away, and it gets close, and it's far away. Every month, it does a complete orbit. Mm-hmm. When the moon is at its closest point to Earth, it's called its perigee. All right? Well, if the moon is a new moon at perigee, at its closest point, you don't even see it. But if the moon is a full moon at its closest point to Earth, according to NASA, it looks 14% larger. It's this big supermoon because it's so close. On September 28th, we not only have a full moon, we have a supermoon that is at its closest point to Earth, not just for the month, but for the entire year. And it's a super blood moon that is going to be seen in Jerusalem on the Feast of Tabernacles and in a Shemitah year.
No, what's a Shemitah year?
Now, the Shemitah year is every 7th year.
Jubilee.
Every 7th year, the land had to rest, and it couldn't be tilled. But the amazing thing is this. Every man, see, God commanded all the men to be in Jerusalem 3 times a year.
Right.
He didn't command the women because the men have to be told what to do. The women don't. Okay? But every 3 times a year, all the men had to be in Jerusalem. But in the Shemitah year, in the 7th year, specifically on the Feast of Tabernacles, it says in Deuteronomy, every man, woman, child, and even the stranger has to be there to hear the King of Israel read from the Scriptures.
What is going to happen?
Well, here's one thing that I think. In the book of Joel you mentioned, where it talks about the sun turning to sackcloth and the moon to blood, it's in the same context that God says he's going to judge all the nations who are trying to divide the land of Israel. And that's what's going on right now. And America is leading the push to divide the land of Israel. And I think these are the heavenly billboard warning signs by God to Israel not to divide their land. It's also that America should not partake. But here's the other thing. We see a war in 1948, a biblically prophetic war. We see a biblically prophetic war in 67. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think there's a good chance we could see a biblically prophetic war in Israel. And the 7th year has been a year of judgment. And do you know in 1994, do you remember the Shoemaker-Levy